Shall we let us turn our attention to Torah, because we are devolving quickly.
Oh, there's music now, Louis. Oh, boy, when you go to Torah, we have music.
Let me shut the door.
Yeah, shut the door.
Yes, that's probably a good plan.
Deuteronomy what?
We are on chapter 32 of the book of Deuteronomy. It looks like a poem.
You know, because you mentioned that yesterday. You mentioned that
Thank you there.
yesterday.
I think you're going too far.
I see you in here. 32 what?
Chapter 32, verse 1.
Oh, I apologize.
Well, I'm sorry.
32 1.
Yep.
There's a long poem sports thing.
Yeah, we're not doing the whole thing. There you go.
32 1. Page 1185. Yes, okay.
Page 1185.
Got it long and be the
Well, I don't think so. It's not quite that long a poem. Okay, so I just want to sort of preface this poem with a little bit about biblical poetry. As I noted at Minyan yesterday morning, most modern scholars accept the premise that biblical poetry represents the earliest stratum of biblical text, that the oral tradition of Torah persists for a much longer period, but that poetry became fixed much earlier than any other part, because stories, morph a little bit by the storyteller, whereas a poem is memorized and then repeated as it is. Otherwise, you could lose some of the rhythm, the rhyme, the metaphors, the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes static as a text much earlier than other pieces. This particular one, we're going to see some very traditional elements of biblical poetry. So in the Torah itself, as it is in the book in front of us, it is laid out in two columns to emphasize the poetic nature of it. So from the moment it's written to reflect its poetic origins. The colons of each phrase are essentially equal or nearly equal in the number of stress units, and it's usually 3. So, for example, Ya'arov kamatar lichi, Zachor yemot olam, Tizal katel imrati. You get the rhythm pattern, and they are built on what scholars call thought rhymes, so that the first and the second half of each phrase sort of echo or reemphasize each other. So, for example, I'll give you from like a couple of examples. Our own hand has prevailed. None of this was wrought by the Lord. You see how they sort of reinforce and sort of add to each other. He fixed the boundaries of people in relation to Israel's numbers. Right? So the thought rhyme, and I understand, I know that doesn't rhyme in English, but it's the idea that the first clause and the second clause are designed to be echoes or builders of the same idea. We see this a lot in Canaanite poetry that we have from the biblical period. And it seems that there was, as in many poetic schools, a repertoire of terms that were traditionally used in parallel with each other. So, for example, give ear and hear, rain, dew, shower, droplets are all part of a group of terms that can be used almost completely interchangeably.
In threes, like a tricolon?
Usually in couplets, in pairs.
Okay.
right? Or you could have create, bring into existence, of old, of ages past. And those would have been conventions which the author of a poem would gravitate towards. In the same way that today you can buy a dictionary of poetic terms that will give you things that resonate linguistically, either by meaning or by sound. And one of the things that we see is there's a lot of assonance that's used, where the letter chaf, sofit, the final chaf, it occurs at the end of many sentences or many words. V'choneneka, koneka, kancha, yachnecha. All right, so you see that, and when we read on Shabbat, you'll notice that I hope you'll notice that.
So this rhymes in Hebrew?
To some degree. Okay, so for example, if you look at verse 2, Yarof kamatar likhi tizal katal imrati. And it continues, Kisirim ale deshe uchrevivim ale esev. The sound. Right? Atzur tamim poalo. Right? It's not rhyming the way we always think of rhyming, but it meant that's why they rely a lot on assonance as a sound rhyme, if you will.
Is that what assonance is?
That's what assonance is.
Thank you.
It is not the act of behaving as one. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay. There's also a phenomenology where certain roots and derivatives of words are derived from the same root. So the word sur, meaning rock, referring to God primarily, occurs in verses 4, 15, 18, 30, 31, 37. So there's a lot of stuff that would have sounded very familiar to the person who was listening to the poem, because it was created to be read to people. It's a spoken document, in the same way that when you study poetry, you really do need to read it out loud, even if you're by yourself. Otherwise, you don't get the flavor and the fullness. And sometimes you need to know the provenance of it in order to be able to read it properly. I remember one of my teachers, Ann Lerner, made us read some poetry that was written by certain people during the Haskalah, during the Enlightenment period. But in order to make it rhyme, you had to realize that they were reading and writing their Hebrew through the prism of Yiddish. So all those things that ended with T's that we read as T's were supposed to be more like S's. You know, kulam lakach haruach, kulam nasa haor. You know, and it's like, oh, then you all of a sudden get the rhythm and the pattern and the rhymes, and it's like, oh. But we're looking at what the words on the page, and the words on the page are written like Hebrew, but they got to be read with a Yiddish inflection. Right? So it's a little more challenging to do that sometimes with biblical stuff, because we haven't met someone from that era. But that's an element of what happens as well. Right. So the other thing that I'll just mention by way of introduction is that this poem is sort of a retrospective on Israel's history, with a declaration of God's exclusivity as owner, creator, and deity of Israel. There's an invitation to join in praising God for all the things that God has done. But the poem also fits a genre of poetry of the ancient world called covenant lawsuit, which sounds very not artistic, right? But a covenant lawsuit was a literary form used when a suzerain would appeal to the deities in condemning one of his vassals for violating a treaty. So this poem, in many ways, served as a declaration of war, right? The suzerain, the king, would list all the things that he's done to benefit the vassal, articulate the vassal's betrayal and disloyalty, and then appeal to witnesses to punish the disloyal vassal. Interestingly, the book of Deuteronomy, which spends a ton of time talking about the covenant between God and Israel, and focuses on the relationship and the responsibilities that are created by God vis-a-vis Israel, is never actually mentioned in this poem. It's almost as if the author of the poem is going, I don't need to mention the covenant because the form of the poem already tells you what's going on. If this is the type of thing that the supreme king would use when he's about to lash out at one of his disloyal vassals, I don't have to mention the word covenant because it's self-understood. In the same way that if I tell you I'm going to give you a limerick, you kind of know what to expect just because you've heard enough limericks and how they go.
Question.
No, there are no limericks in the Bible.
No. Who's the author? And only because I'm asking for why it's included here, because it's not a pronouncement for Moses. This is a poem that's inserted here. So who is this, a famous person or what?
Okay. The answer is it is attributed to Moses, though probably not Mosaic in origin, right? Whether the roots of it go back to Moses is that would be a matter of faith and belief. Most of the time, material that is included is never attributed, right? Because if I, Yankel, write this, who cares? Nobody wants to hear Yankel's poem. Moses, however, carries a lot of weight. Yeah, it's like attributing the book of Psalms to King David, right? Or the book of Proverbs to Solomon, right? So you build this idea of Solomon as the wisest of all kings and rulers and human beings with the ability to speak many languages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's the smartest person who ever was. And then you attribute the book of Proverbs to him because who else would write such brilliant wisdom literature? Except for the fact that it's a genre of wisdom literature that is, 500 or 600 years or more after Solomon's time. Okay. Do we know who wrote it? Not so much.
Thank you, Rob.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Part of what also clues us in to the later aspect of it is the people seem to be settled in the promised land. Israel's apostasy and lack of fealty is described in some ways as a past event, but the poem speaks to a generation that is guilty in the present. right? There's no reference to exile, which is something that is common in the book of Deuteronomy, which suggests that this predates the book of Deuteronomy, which was found during the time of King Josiah, which is the late 7th century. There are some suggestions that some of the mocking challenge that God expresses here is very similar to parts of the book of Judges, and specifically parts of chapter 10 in the book of Judges. So the suggestion is the poem may emanate from that period of the Judges, which is some 200 years after the arrival of the Israelites in the Promised Land and before the rise of the monarchy. Right? And what was one of the characteristics of the period of the Judges? The book of Judges essentially is a repeating cycle of events. Things are going great. Everything is fantastic. The Israelites are thriving and successful. And so therefore, they do exactly what the Moshe or the author here warns against. Don't think that this is all because of you. No, your thriving and success is because you are benefiting from God's blessings. Don't forget God. Get swell-headed and think, I did this all by myself. Yay me. Right? And therefore turn away from God, which is what happens in the period of the Judges. Things are fabulous. The people turn away from God. God does not care for that dismissal. And therefore, the Israelites are then attacked by their surrounding enemies. Things get really bad and they go from bad to worse. The people then say, oi, or words to that effect, and they return to God, who sends a chieftain to lead them in battle against their enemies. And because the people have now returned to God, God allows them to be successful and victorious in throwing off the ravages and shackles of their enemies. And boom, things come back to the top where everybody is thriving and successful and everything is wonderful and terrific. Right? But as I said, it's a repeating cycle. So the minute you enter a period of thriving success, it leads to a forgetting of God, and the whole thing goes whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And the Israelites are kind of stuck in this rinse and repeat cycle.
We had that in the Torah discussion about 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
If I remember it right.
Yes, it is not a new idea, and it is an idea that does come in the book of Deuteronomy, which is why this fits in some ways very nicely into the modality of you're gonna mess up. The question is, to what degree are you going to mess up? And how will that happen? Right? And another idea that sort of weaves through is why does God not simply say, you know what? Failed experiment, gonna start over. And the same idea that's articulated in the book of Deuteronomy at various times, which is what is God's ultimate purpose in choosing Israel to be his flagship nation? What does he want the Israelites to accomplish, if you will? Okay, so what's our job description?
So I'll offer,
Yeah, go ahead.
that it's that they should it's that we should recognize the incorporeality of God and that he is one, that God is one, and all that comes from that.
True, but you're getting a little too thinky
Okay.
for our
That
ancestors.
wouldn't surprise me. How they do that.
The job description is, you shall be a nation of priests and a light unto the nations.
Yeah.
All right, you shall be the exemplars of what it means to live consistent with an awareness of God and God's expectations, and you should model that behavior in such a way that others will go, oh,
That's in Elena.
it is in Alenu, but it doesn't start
Yeah,
there.
right. Right. Yes.
But it's this idea that ultimately what God wants is for everybody to recognize and acknowledge God as the source of blessing and beneficence in the world, right? Now, we can spend a different class, putting the Holy One on the sofa and explore why God needs this validation from us. It's a little heretical when you say it that way, but
Mhm.
you understand the intent there. But if the goal is for the people to be a paradigmatic model of how to approach God, how to behave, then when the Israelites don't behave that way, it means that they are failing in their divine mission. Right? And we've seen both in the book of Numbers and it really throughout the entire narrative of the Exodus and the travel is God sometimes wants to say, you know what, Moses, let's just start over. I started over with Abraham. I'll start over with you. All right, this is not working. And Moshe says, no. And he reminds God, no, if you do that, people will get the wrong idea. They won't conclude that you're punishing the Israelites. They're going to conclude that you couldn't deliver on your promises. All right. So what ends up happening is God then sort of takes up that idea of, I'm not going to just get rid of you. I'm going to punish you, with the goal being to get you back on the right track. And regardless of how far removed from the right track you get, there's a path back into which you can become my exemplars in the world. So you're not ever going to be free of this covenantal agreement. Right? Disloyalty is punished, but punishment is limited. Okay, that's sort of a longish introduction to our parsha. So let's read a little bit and see what we get. Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. May my discourse come down as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass. For the name of the Lord I proclaim, give glory to our God, the rock. His deeds are perfect. Yea, all his ways are just. A faithful God, never false. True and upright is he. Okay, we're going to stop there. All right. So what are the things that leap out in just those first opening verses?
Listen,
Hmm?
Listen up.
yeah,
All right. Pay attention.
Mhm.
and then water, because you need water for growth,
Okay.
Very good.
and
All right.
I'm talking about God and you've got to kind of honor him.
Okay, I want to back up a little bit. Who is being asked to listen?
Us,
Oh heavens.
the earth.
Uh-huh. Those things which are permanent. Right? I want witnesses. I want, it ties back to that model of a covenant poem, or an attack poem, a covenant lawsuit, right? Who are the witnesses? I need people.
Israel.
No, they're
Everybody-
witnesses against Israel, heaven and earth, the things that have been watching forever. You saw all the stuff that I did on their behalf, and now look at their behavior. Testify against them. Right? And remember that in Israelite biblical law, who punishes the criminal first, generally?
The witnesses?
Yes, the hand of the witnesses. So if I'm testifying against you that you're guilty of certain things, I have to,
Throw the first stone.
I throw the first stone, literally. So now what's interesting is that in point of fact, the heavens and the earth don't come back into this, but it's the idea that someone who's been watching this story play out, and the story plays out over centuries, right?
So it's also saying that listen and kind of change and go back on the right path is when you listen to this.
Well, we're getting there, but this is sort of the prelude to it. Like, yes, I'm talking to you, but I'm not addressing you yet. Right? Give ear, O heavens. Let the earth, right? That's who the first listeners are, the things that will testify against you. Right? And think about the discourse and the speech, rain and dew and showers and droplets, right? To say that rain and dew and water are pervasive is an understatement, right? The difference is all of the examples that are used here are positive ones, right? This is not torrential rain. This is not the kind of stuff that we've been watching unfold on the news. Right? This is rain in its season and dew to water the plants. This is the blessing kind of rain. And therefore, now it's sort of addressed to the Israelites. Because of all of this blessing that you receive from God, give glory to our God. Right? Why? God is perfect. He's just. He's faithful. He's true. He's upright. He's better than a Boy Scout. Okay? And then you get to verse 5. Children unworthy of him, that crooked, perverse generation, their baseness has played him false. Do you thus requite the Lord, O dull and witless people? Is not he the Father who created you, fashioned you, and made you endure? Okay. You can hear the echo of this covenantal lawsuit. I brought the blessings that were essential to your survival, and boom, this is how you act.
That's a parenting statement.
It is a parenting statement.
So all the things I've done for you, and you do the following.
Yes, it's absolutely a parenting statement. All right. And by the way, think about it, goes so far as to say, is not he the Father who created you? Right? And that's not just an Adam and Eve created you. It's like the Israelites as a nation come into being because God rescues them from Egypt. It's at that moment that they emerge on this on the stage as a nation, as a people. Remember, when they go down to Egypt, it's Jacob and sons. It's a nice business, maybe thriving, successful, but it's a family affair. They leave Egypt as a nation, as a people, under the tutelage, direction, and oversight of God.
Rabbi, requite, that word requite, what does that word mean?
Repay.
Okay.
Do you thus repay the Lord? Okay, and yeah, gets a little nasty. Dull and witless is hardly a compliment, but we see parallels to that sort of language in Ugaritic texts and other texts, and reflects both that poetic history that I mentioned earlier, where you tapped into existing metaphors because those were familiar to people. And it also, yeah, leave it at that. It's just part of the phenomenology that you see. Let's move on just a little bit more. Remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past. Ask your father, he will inform you, your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of people in relation to Israel's numbers. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment. All right, let's stop there. All right. So we're going back in time. How far back are we going?
Way back.
Way back, right? In fact, I would suggest that verse 8 perhaps suggests that we're going back to a time even before Jacob, way before Jacob, right? If you want to learn about the past, you can't go on the internet. You can't, order on Amazon, History of the World, Part 1, which we get a nice movie, but not much history. It's oral tradition that's been handed down, right? When the Most High, right, one of the standard old biblical terms for God, Elyon or El Elyon, is a term for God that we usually associate with the book of Genesis, and it's used both by Jews and non-Jews. It may in fact reflect a vestige of polytheism in the Bible. But when God gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, when does this happen?
Early, I mean, it's like Ham, Japheth.
Okay, so that's after what event?
This
Creation.
flood.
A few people running around.
Yeah, later.
Probably after Noah's Ark.
It has to be after Noah's Ark, because after the Ark, there's not a whole lot of people, and you have to go even a little bit later than that. Okay, so if you remember, if you've memorized the entire Torah, which I'm sure you have, if you go to chapter 11 in the book of Breshit, which is just before Abraham enters the story, we have the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And if you remember what's going on in the story a little bit, the people are worried about what? What is it that motivates them to try to build the Tower of Babel in the first place?
They want to reach the heavens.
Partly, But what else are they worried about? Hey, you got a perfectly good Bible in front of you. Go to chapter 11. This is an open book quiz, chapter 11 in the book of Genesis. So you got to go way closer to the beginning.
They have the same language and same words. the same
All right,
language.
so they have the same language. And so what are they worried about? Come, let us build a tower with its top in the heavens so that.
Oh, to make a
Name
name
for
for
ourselves.
ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world.
To make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered. The suggestion being, we all live together.
Sounds like a universalism or a,
All right.
what you
We
call it,
all live together. All right, and we like it that way. So we're going to build this tower, and somehow that's going to ensure that we all stick together. Right? What happens at the end?
God gets rid of the tower and scatters them and gives them different languages.
Uses-
The thing that they were aiming to avoid is exactly the outcome of the story, wherein people are scattered throughout Mesopotamia for our purposes here in the biblical narrative, and they develop their own languages and all sorts of stuff. Are they familiar and similar? Sure they are. That's why we can talk about Akkadian and Ugaritic and Sumerian and all these others as cognate languages, because they're derivations of the same thing. But at a certain point, they stop being easily understood by each other, right? In the same way that Hebrew and Arabic are cognate languages, but I can speak Hebrew. I can curse a little bit in Arabic, but and if I break it down, eventually I can sort of parse it out a little bit, but literally the alphabet is different, which makes it that much harder to read it and therefore to figure out, oh, it's the same word. So, and we know this, it's like, this is not a secret, salam is Arabic for shalom, all right? It's the same roots, all right? But so I know that there's cognates and connections, but just because I know one at a certain point in time means I don't know how to use the other. All right, in the same way that Russian and French have a lot of kind of overlays linguistically, but I don't know the Cyrillic alphabet. I never learned the Cyrillic. Well, I suppose I could have if I wanted to. I just didn't have any particular interest in doing so. In which case, I might have been able to read Russian well enough to say, oh, that's like the French word, blah, 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 blah. In the same way that, if you learn the Greek alphabet and you look at some ancient Greek and you sound it out, you're gonna, oh, I know that word. Like, if I said to you, Okeanos, what does that sound like?
Opiano.
Okeanos. Okeanos.
Okay.
All right, I'll make it a little easier because I gave it a hard K, but it could be a softer one. Oceanus.
Oh,
Yeah.
Ta-da!
Yeah.
All right, congratulations, you now know ancient Greek. And there's a lot of that. Once you can sound it out, it's like, oh, I see the connections. But if it's in a different alphabet that I can't read it, I can't sound it out, and I still have the issue of, am I sounding it out correctly?
Also, I mean, there's the verse that says, if as one people, one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. So really what I think one of the thoughts there is that maybe they could think they could do without God.
Perhaps.
I mean, that's
Right.
what they
You know, we're storming the kingdom,
Right.
all right, the kingdom of God. We're going to enter the realm of the deities. And we're going to climb, to change it into a different idiom, we're going to climb Mount Olympus. Right? But that's what's underlying verse 8 over here. When the Most High gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to Israel's numbers. In other words, one day, even though the Israelites don't even exist yet, I need to account for them in the geography of this world. And in the meantime, yes, the Canaanites will be in the land, and some of the otherites will inhabit the land, but ultimately they're just placeholders for the Israelites. And also tied into this, right? Yeah, so there's a predictiveness that's embedded here. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment, right? The Israelites belong to God, which raises the question, to whom does everyone else belong?
To God.
Yes, but if God is exclusive, or if Jacob, Israel, is God's portion, then everybody else seems like less consequential, all right? And it goes in some ways to the biblical view of the origin of polytheism. The worship of idols, of celestial beings, begins with this division of humanity into separate nations after the Tower of Babel. Right? From the biblical perspective, at least the Torah's perspective, the punishment of humanity's repeated spurning of God, because that's what triggers the flood in the first place, and then is seen as underlying the story of the Tower of Babel. God deprives humanity of a true knowledge of God and says, essentially, if you want to worship idols, if you want to ignore the ultimate God, then I will assign to you a bunch of subordinate beings in heavenly bodies. You want to worship the sun, moon, and the stars because you think they're God? Gesundheit, have at it. It's fine. God's no longer going to be upset by that, because God has refocused. All right, I'm not going to work on everybody. I'm going to choose Abraham and his descendants as the objects of my personal attention. I'm going to create a model nation, and the others will see the blessings that are bestowed on the Israelites because they are God's particularly chosen people, and eventually get the idea, oh, maybe this worshiping God thing is a good idea. And so from the Torah's perspective, there's no sin for other nations worshiping idols or heavenly bodies or trees or anything else, because that's who gets them, all right? They belong to these other lesser things. It's only, so in the Torah, the view is sort of a long-term thing that eventually they'll figure it out by watching the Israelites. The problem becomes when the Israelites betray their job description. Hold that thought for half a second. It's only in the period of the prophets, and sometimes the later prophets, that you begin to change this idea about how the others are supposed to behave. All right, this expectation that the nations will recognize God, and until they do, they're sort of acting sinfully and therefore deserve to be punished for idolatry, is an idea that is fairly late. It's in Jeremiah, it's in Ezekiel, it's in 2nd Isaiah, sort of toward the end of the prophetic period. Okay, Bill and then Arnie.
No, you are just answered my question.
Okay, and then in that case, Bill and not Arnie.
Thank you, Rabbi. I was going to ask, the Jews are seen as, God's chosen people, but what do the other faiths, Christians and Arabs and other faiths feel about, are they also God's chosen people to them?
Okay, so I will suggest that all the Abrahamic faiths assert their chosenness. Right? The church has for a long period of time embraced a model of what's called supersession. Right?
The new covenant.
We were God's chosen people. We meaning the Israelites / the Jews. But the church now asserts that we are in fact the new chosen people, because darn those Israelites / Jews, they were messing up so much that God decided that we needed something new and better. Hence the New Testament, the new church, right? And they use some of the existing biblical metaphors to try to prove their ascendancy. So, for example, think about the story of Jacob and Esau, right? Which one is the older of the two? Esau, all right? But Esau is rejected in favor of Jacob. Right? We could do the same thing with Yishmael and Yitzchak. Yishmael is the elder who is rejected in favor of Yitzchak, the younger. Right? So the church says, yeah, you guys are actually the elders who are now rejected by God in favor of us, the youngers. It's very creative and clever. Right? And it falls into this very traditional biblical model where the eldest is often rejected. Abraham is not the eldest of his brother amongst his brothers. David is the youngest of his brothers. Moses is not the eldest in his family. Right? It is a rarity in many ways for the eldest to be the one chosen to succeed, except for the fact that the Torah is adamant that if Joe Schmo has multiple wives and the oldest son comes from the wife that he decides he doesn't like, tough noogies, the oldest son gets the double portion of inheritance. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So on the one hand, the Torah says, no. You can't elevate the younger over the older, unless, of course, you're God, in which case you get to violate the rules, because the rules are for you to do, whereas God has a bigger perspective and chooses the person that will be the best link in the chain of tradition, continuity, and moving the divine agenda forward. By the way, Islam does kind of the same thing with Yishmael. All right. It's not Isaac who is the inheritor of Abraham. It's Yishmael who is the inheritor. And you know that story about the binding of Isaac?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's the binding of Ishmael in the Quran. With some minor variations, but it's the idea of no. And by the way, the church loves the story of the binding of Isaac.
It's the Jesus on the cross.
It's the whole Jesus thing. Yes. And in fact, the difference is See, Jesus is better than Isaac because he actually dies. And there's a whole, by the way, there was a whole midrashic strand that talked about how Abraham does not stop and sacrifices Isaac, and God brings him back to life. In other words, without which there would be no next in line.
Interesting.
It's a fascinating strand. You may hear more about it soon.
Does that go back to Prometheus bound in the Greeks? He's the one that tied to the mountain.
Yeah,
That's-
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the-
No, it's an I hadn't really given that much thought now, but now I have to.
We'll think about it some other time.
I will. I'm not going to think about it right now, but
Not everybody brings up Prometheus, so.
What was it that you said?
It's
Prometheus.
Prometheus, it's Prometheus
yeah.
bound, it's a play, a Greek
know it.
play by Aeschylus
mhm.
before the trilogy.
Yeah, so my only thought is these stories percolate throughout the ancient world and motifs repeat, right? It's like the story of the banished child, right? Ishmael is banished and he's in the wilderness and he's about to die, and then an angel intercedes and helps Hagar find the well of water, and all of a sudden he goes on to become a great nation, which he's blessed with. That's part of the biblical narrative. Well, that's echoed in the story of Romulus and Remus, who are cast away, found and raised by wolves, who go on to become the founders of Rome. Oh, okay. That echoes familiar. So story motifs repeat. You know, the greatness of a literary work is not necessarily in how it creates a new motif, but how it uses a known motif in a way that draws us in. The trappings change, right? You know, the orphaned child, I mean, that's Romulus and Remus, right? Who has to go through all sorts of challenges before emerging successful. All right. And that's a motif, the hero motif, if you will. Right. And how is the hero motif that plays out in the Iliad and even more so in the Odyssey? Right? Think of all the things Nebuch, the guy, has to go through just to get home. Right? And then fast forward to Harry Potter. I mean, yes, I know I just jumped 2 millennia,
Quite a jump, sports fans.
but the reality is this guy who is orphaned, who's raised by step parents who really, really mistreat him. By the way, along the way, you could Oliver, Cinderella, blah, 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 blah. The evil step parent is kind of a ubiquitous motif. Right? And all the things that he goes through as he's maturing and becoming an adult. So how is it any different?
The rising of the Phoenix.
Yeah, it's the same motif, but J.K. Rowling managed to do it pretty damn well because she sold an awful lot of books and those movies were pretty darn popular.
Right.
Because they were pretty darn popular.
Star Wars is similar.
Star Wars, the same thing. You have Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia. Their mother dies, they're orphaned, they're separated. You know, each of them grows in their own way, one in isolation, one in sort of in a more royal setting, and how that affects their growth and development. But they ultimately have to go through the adventure and they emerge victorious. right? And by the way, if you then fast forward to the next generation of Star Wars, where we're introduced to Rey, who is a scavenger on this backwater planet, who is an orphan who keeps waiting for her parents to come back and get her, only to learn along the way that, oh, they're dead.
Superman,
Superman.
yeah, those two Jewish guys developed themselves.
Yeah.
That's Moses.
It's a Moses story. There's a whole, like I said, we could find the motif repeating and repeating and repeating, but the brilliance of the author is taking the familiar motif and presenting it in a way that makes us want to listen. Right?
But I think it's not just a motif. I think there's a reality to that kind of relationship that is formed for kids that are sort of orphaned, even if their parents were good, or good for them. But it's always and probably a lot more parents weren't good to their orphan children because their motive for doing it could
But
be monetary.
But Sam, think about it. The reason this works,
Yeah.
the hero motif in whatever permutation you present it works, is because it doesn't just work for the orphan kid.
No, I
It
understand.
speaks to
The-
every kid. It's like, I too can be. Right? When what's his name? And Schuster,
Leia?
no, the Superman guys. I'm forgetting one of the guys'
Oh, their
names.
parents, you mean?
No, the creators.
The creators that sold it.
Is
Oh, comic
Jerry
books?
Schuster and
That's the other brother, that's the other brother. Oh, never mind.
I'm blanking on the other guy's name, all right? They created a character that was meant to be the personification of their struggles as Jews in America. That's what Superman was. It was them working out the question of Jewish identity. For more on this, come to the lunch and learn in the sukkah in a few weeks.
Good. That's-
I'll trade my,
Not that I was thinking I was going to end with a commercial, but there you go.
I'll have to trade my Batman comics to get to the Superman discussion too.
No, we accept all of those.
Okay.
Though Batman Day was a few weeks ago, for the record.
No, it's an interesting tie-in. I'd like to see a great discussion to it. Yeah,
I hope so.
thank you.
Let me know. I'll let you know when I finish working on.
But thank
okay.
you.
Javier, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Let me wish you all Shana Tova, though I hope I will see at least some of you in person.
Tomorrow night, 8:00.
Be there or be square. Or
Most
at least
definitely.
miss out on all the good food.
Robert.